My mother was trembling while clearing the Thanksgiving table when my millionaire brother pushed a power of attorney toward her to sign, as his wife smiled behind expensive wine, while I watched her dry hands and how she hurried to hide calluses from scrubbing floors under her apron, unaware I hold the tax evasion files they filed in her name. Seeing those hands broke the soldier in me. I am Major Maisy Harrison. Thank you for staying. If you have ever seen a loved one treated unfairly, please listen to this story. I walked through the door at exactly 6 o'clock, still carrying the scent of a long flight and the dust of my military assignment. But the first thing that hit me was the smell of the past. The kitchen still carried that faint, familiar mix of Maxwell House coffee and Sunlight dish soap, exactly the way it has since 1987. My mother was standing there, looking smaller than I remembered, her old Skechers worn down at the heels. She was fumbling with a box of Jiffy cornbread mix, the cheap kind she never would have used when my father was alive. Then I saw it. A tiny Nest camera was mounted on the corner of the cabinet, its lifeless black lens staring down at the dining table like a scout's eye. My mother offered a smile, but her hands were shaking as she tried to twist the lid off a jar of store-brand peanut butter. I did not need a map to know that this kitchen had become a place where she was struggling to hold the line alone. I moved to help her, but she quickly tucked her hands under the hem of her floral apron. That was when I noticed the stack of bright red envelopes from the electric company sitting right next to a pile of Medicare statements. She swept them into a drawer as if they were secrets she could not let me see. She told me she was doing just fine, that she still went on her morning walks and attended the garden club, but the refrigerator was bone-chillingly empty. There were only a few expired yogurt cups and half a loaf of dry bread. I walked over and quietly opened the medicine cabinet, and my heart sank when I saw her lisinopril prescription. The round white tablets were jagged and broken. They had been clumsily split in half with a kitchen knife. My mother was rationing her own life, dividing her heartbeats just to make up for numbers I had not yet learned to name. I leaned against the counter and tried to control my breathing, the way I was trained to do before a difficult situation. I had spent 2 years in Germany, protecting distant borders, while my mother's security was being taken away right here under this roof. I wondered how I could have been so blind, believing those short FaceTime calls where she always wore her best blue sweater and told me everything was wonderful. I looked up at that Nest camera again. It was not there to protect her from intruders. It was there to watch her, to make sure she stayed quiet and did exactly what she was told. A cold sense of guilt crawled through my chest, as thick as the morning fog over Lake Morrison. I had left her alone in this kitchen for too long, and the cost of my silence was written in every jagged piece of those white pills. The doorbell rang, a sharp, artificial chime that shattered the heavy silence left by the sight of those broken white pills. It was the rhythm of a different world, a hollow brightness about to flood into this quiet, dusty house to mask the neglect I had just uncovered. I looked at the medicine cabinet one last time before stepping into the living room, feeling like a scout watching an incoming tide of staged perfection. On the living room wall, my father's portrait in his colonel's uniform still hung in its place, his steady gaze looking down over a history of discipline and honor. Beneath him, his beret, his medals, and the family Bible with its worn, leather-bound spine were arranged with a precision that felt more like a museum than a home. I remembered when this house was alive, filled with the rich scent of roasting turkey and the sound of my father's laughter at the head of the table. Back then, my mother was the center of it all, radiant in her Sunday silk dress, her hands busy and confident as she managed the chaos of a Thanksgiving feast. Now, the room felt like an abandoned outpost. A thin layer of dust had settled over my father's old lazy boy recliner, and my mother, the woman who used to be the life of every party, was now making herself small in the corner of the sofa. She looked at the old photographs with a longing she couldn't quite hide, a silent admission that the world she once knew had moved on without her. The front door swung open, and Kian and Victoria stepped inside, bringing with them the polished, expensive air of upper-class Atlanta. My brother looked every bit the successful tech mogul in his custom-tailored suit, his handmade leather shoes polished to such a high gloss they could have served as mirrors. I looked at those shoes and knew they cost more than 6 months of my mother's pension. Victoria was just as striking in her designer silk dress, a new luxury handbag draped over her arm like a trophy. She moved toward my mother and gave her a hug, but the gesture was quick and shallow, a diplomatic necessity rather than an act of affection. As Victoria started gushing about their recent vacation to Tuscany, I watched my mother instinctively pull her dry, cracked hands deeper into the folds of her apron. The contrast was like a physical blow to my chest. While her son spoke in the language of million-dollar contracts and high-end retreats, my mother was quietly counting pennies to keep the lights on. I stood by the mantel, feeling like a complete stranger in my own family. Kian's success felt hollow, a glittering facade built on a foundation of absolute neglect. I remembered my father used to tell us that the true measure of a man was how he cared for the women in his life, and looking at Kian, I saw a profound betrayal of that legacy. He didn't see how much weight Mom had lost. He didn't see the scars on her hands from the night shifts she spent scrubbing office floors just to buy food for my father's aging dog. He only saw his own reflection in the lens of his accomplishments. A hot, steady pulse of righteous anger began to hum in my veins, a warning that this holiday would not end with a peaceful dinner. The glitz and the silk didn't fool me. I was a soldier, and I knew exactly what was being hidden behind those expensive smiles. Dinner began in a forced, heavy silence. The sound of silverware clicking against the family china felt like metal on cold stone, sharp and unforgiving. Victoria kept pouring the expensive Cabernet, her movements hurried as she tried to fill the gaps in conversation with talk of high-end real estate. But I could tell she was trying to bury something deep beneath the chatter. Kian leaned back in his chair with a practiced, generous smile. He took a sip of his wine and looked at my mother with a look of staged benevolence, asking her how she was enjoying that new lake house in Morrison he had bought for her 2 years ago. He claimed the view there was surely the best in the county. The room went suddenly, deathly quiet. I watched my mother set her fork down, and it hit the plate with a thin, brittle clink that made my teeth ache. She looked up at him with hollow eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke the words that made my stomach drop. "What house, Kian? What are you talking about?" Victoria's napkin slipped from her lap and hit the floor, her face turning ashen under the candlelight, and I caught the sharp, urgent look she shot at Kian when his guard dropped. I felt the blood in my veins begin to boil. A $600,000 villa by the lake? Kian truly believed he had gifted her a paradise, while my mother was still sitting in this drafty old house, breaking blood pressure pills in half with a kitchen knife just to survive. This was not just a misunderstanding. It was a total betrayal of trust. I looked at my mother and saw the humiliation burning in her eyes, not because she lacked a house, but because she realized she had been made a pawn in her son's display of success. He had not even bothered to check if his own mother had actually moved in. I understood right then that there was a ghost operating that money, and that ghost was sitting right across from me, smiling behind a glass of expensive wine. Kian tried to laugh it off, his voice trembling as he insisted that Victoria had handled all the paperwork and that he had spent over $600,000 on the place. My mother did not laugh. She slowly stood up and began clearing plates she had not even touched, telling him firmly that she had been right here, in my father's house, for 30 years and had never seen any house at Lake Morrison. I stared at Victoria. She began stammering about broker errors or suggesting that perhaps Mom had simply forgotten, but I knew that look. It was the look of a predator caught in the headlights. I tightened my grip under the table. This was no longer a family dinner. This was an interrogation. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke a person. I watched Keon, seeing his self-importance shatter into fragments of confusion. He was wealthy, but he was the blindest man in this room. He had let his wife weave a web of lies so thick he could no longer see his own mother wasting away right in front of him. I thought about the months she spent scrubbing office floors to pay the electric bill, while Kean believed she was watching sunsets over the water. This invisibility was crueler than any physical wound. I knew in that moment I had to step forward, not just as a daughter, but as a soldier protecting the last shreds of my mother's dignity. I think about those of you listening tonight. I wonder if you have ever sat at a family table and realized you were becoming a ghost in the very life you built. Perhaps you have sacrificed everything, only to realize the ones you love most are not actually looking at you. If you carry a quiet pain like my mother, please share it with me in the comments. And if this story touches you, please press like, so I know I am not telling this alone. After that horrific dinner, sleep was impossible. I lay in my childhood bed listening to the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair on the porch, a sound that usually brought me peace but now felt like a ticking clock counting down to a confrontation I was not yet ready for. I knew I could not wait for the morning sun to find the answers I needed. The silence in the house was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of my mother's confusion and my brother's blind arrogance. I sat up and pulled my iPhone from the nightstand, the bright blue light cutting through the darkness of the room and casting cold, sharp shadows across the floral wallpaper that had not changed since I was a teenager. I began scrolling through Kean's public profiles on LinkedIn and recent business journals, reading interviews where he was hailed as an elite philanthropist and a visionary leader. Seeing those words made my stomach turn. I searched for a specific name in my contacts. Rebecca, the family's longtime financial assistant who had been a steady presence since my father's funeral. I knew it was nearly midnight in Atlanta, but in my world, the truth does not have a closing time. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice into the steady, authoritative tone of a major, and pressed call. When she finally answered with a groggy, confused hello, I did not give her the chance to hang up. I told her it was Maisy Harrison and that I needed the identification numbers for my mother's retirement accounts immediately. Maisy, is everything okay at this hour? Rebecca's voice was thick with sleep, but I could hear the immediate shift as her professional instincts kicked in. I heard the faint, rhythmic click of keys being tapped on a laptop on the other end of the line. She told me she thought Victoria had already handled all of this, explaining that Victoria had requested total privacy for my mother's accounts due to health reasons. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white, asking her who that privacy was supposed to protect, if it was keeping my mother in the dark. I told her to read me the routing numbers. Rebecca hesitated for a long, agonizing second before reciting a string of digits ending in 4782. I scribbled them into my green military notebook, my hand steady even as my chest felt tight. Then I asked the question that mattered most: the name of the designated beneficiary. The silence on the line lasted so long I could hear the sound of my own shallow breathing. Finally, Rebecca whispered the name Victoria Stevens. She said Victoria had claimed it was my father's final wish to avoid inheritance taxes and protect my mother from the burden of management. A cold chill ran down my spine, more piercing than any winter wind I had felt overseas. Victoria Stevens, not my mother. Victoria had woven a digital web of ghost accounts where my mother's hard-earned pension was flowing directly into her own pockets under the guise of being a caretaker. She had used my father's death, the most painful moment of our lives, to craft a lie that allowed her to feast on his legacy. I felt a surge of pure disgust. Victoria was not just stealing money. She was consuming the very security my father had spent 30 years of service to provide for his wife. And Kean, my brother, the supposed tech genius, was an emotional child who had handed over the keys to the vault to a predator. I looked up at my father's portrait on the wall, his eyes steady in the dim light, and I made a silent promise to him that I would not let this occupation of our home last another day. I stood up and walked quietly down the hallway toward my mother's room, my footsteps practiced and silent on the floorboards. She was asleep, but her brow was furrowed in a deep line of worry even in her dreams. On the small table beside her bed sat the old nightstand lamp my father had bought for her 3 decades ago, its brass base tarnished but familiar. I reached for her worn leather wallet and gently opened it, finding her Medicare card tucked behind a library card and several small handwritten slips of paper. They were debt tallies from the local pharmacy, totaling $450. It was such a small number compared to the price of Kian's shoes or Victoria's handbags, but for my mother, it was a mountain she was climbing alone. I used my phone to photograph everything: the pharmacy debts, the empty bank cards, and the jagged, half-cut pills in her organizer. This was my mission file. Tomorrow, I would no longer be the dutiful daughter standing on the sidelines. I was going to be the one who restored the order of this house. By 4 a.m, the fog from Lake Morrison began to crawl over the porch, wrapping the house in a thick, white shroud that blurred the edges of the world. I stepped outside and stood at the railing, standing tall as if I were in front of the colors at a morning formation. The world was so quiet I could hear the soft lap of the water against the old, rotting wooden dock in the distance. This was the place my father had chosen for his retirement, a place where he believed my mother would live out her days with honor and peace. Looking out at the gray water, the exhaustion seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, clear focus. Rebecca's unexpected honesty, her decision to tell the truth even when it risked her job, gave me a flicker of hope. There were still allies out there. I just had to find them and bring them into the light. I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and deep shame as I watched the sky begin to turn a pale, bruised purple. I was grateful for a stranger's help, but ashamed that my own blood had allowed this house to rot from the inside. Why did someone who barely knew us care more about my mother's dignity than her own son did? Why had the discipline I built my life upon failed to take root in this home? I realized I had been so busy protecting things on the other side of the ocean that I had ignored the most important base of all while it was being dismantled piece by piece. But I knew one thing for certain: Major Maisy Harrison does not retreat. I was going to begin a counter-reclamation of this house, step by step, until my mother was sitting back at the head of that table with her pride fully restored. After the long night of scouring through those debt slips and red envelopes, I knew I could not let my mother spend another second locked inside these 4 walls. Victoria wanted everyone to believe she was fading, that her mind was a crumbling house. But I was going to show her that Margaret Laura Harrison was still the most resilient woman in Lake Morrison. I woke her up early the next morning, gently insisting she put on that blue floral dress she used to wear for Sunday service when my father was still alive. Victoria was already standing in the hallway, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, suspicious look. She tried to block our way with a voice as sweet as fake syrup, telling me that Mom was tired and that she would just make her some oatmeal instead. I did not even look at her. I simply took my mother's cold hand in mine and walked straight to the car. I drove her down to the Bluebird Diner in the center of town, where the smell of sizzling bacon and hot pancakes has hung in the air for 30 years. The second the bell on the door chimed, Linda, the owner, let out a joyful cry and ran over to wrap her arms around my mother. She kept saying how worried she had been because Victoria told everyone Laura was too sick to leave the house. I watched my mother's face as a soft pink color began to return to her pale cheeks. The Bluebird Diner had not changed at all, with its worn red vinyl booths and the soft crackle of Frank Sinatra playing over the speakers. I led her to a table by the window, where the November sun streamed through the green ferns. Linda did not even ask. She just placed a steaming mug of coffee and a plate of eggs Benedict in front of her, exactly the way my mother liked it. I sat back and just watched. Several women from her old garden club stopped by the table to say hello. My mother did not miss a beat. She remembered every rose variety they discussed and even asked about the birthday of Linda's grandson. Her mind was as sharp as a diamond under that morning sun, cutting right through every lie Victoria had spent 2 years building. I saw her shoulders finally drop, the tension leaving her body as she stopped huddling like a frightened bird. She was beginning to sit tall again, reclaiming the posture of a woman who had once run an entire military household. I sat there sipping my bitter coffee, feeling a lump of relief in my throat that I could barely swallow. Victoria had been so successful in building a psychological prison around her, making her believe she was nothing but a burden to be managed. Looking at the other women her age laughing and sharing stories around us, I realized that isolation is the most vicious tool of all. It wears away at a person's dignity faster than any physical ailment ever could. Hearing my mother actually laugh out loud when Linda reminded her of an old joke, I knew I was moving in the right direction. The person who did this had not just stolen her money, she had stolen her right to exist in the world. But today, at this scratched wooden table, my mother had finally started to walk out of the shadow that had been cast over her. Before we left, I made sure she was the one who handled the bill. I had opened a private account for her earlier that morning, and I handed her the new card. She looked at the check, then up at me, her hand shaking just a little as she signed her name, Margaret Laura Harrison. Her signature was still as firm and beautiful as I remembered. Linda squeezed her hand and told her to come back often, reminding her not to let the kids keep her cooped up at home. My mother just nodded, her eyes no longer looking hollow or lost. When we stepped out of the diner, she did not even need my arm for support. She walked with a steady, certain stride in her old Skechers, heading toward the car with a confidence I had not seen in years. I knew the real struggle was still ahead of us, but at least for today, my mother remembered exactly who she was. The confidence in my mother's eyes after our breakfast at the diner gave me a flicker of hope, but the instinct of a seasoned officer told me that Victoria was not the type of person to let a target slip away so easily. I knew her smiles were nothing more than a carefully maintained veneer, and I needed something solid, physical evidence that would dismantle every justification she had prepared. While Victoria was upstairs occupied with a hushed, frantic phone call, I slipped out to the back alley where the family's old metal mailbox stood, rusted and long since forgotten. My mother had lost the key years ago, but I pulled my multi-tool from my pocket and worked the thin blade into the latch until it surrendered with a sharp, metallic snap. I pulled out a thick bundle of envelopes, heavy with dust and tangled in spiderwebs. Most were just colorful flyers, but buried in the middle were 3 orange and white envelopes from Chase Bank. They were addressed to Margaret Harrison, but the billing address was for an apartment on Maple Street, a place I knew for a fact my mother had never stepped foot in. I tore them open with hands that were starting to tremble with a cold, quiet anger. They were past due notices for multiple credit cards, showing a total debt of over $20,000. The transaction logs were an endless list of luxury shopping at Nordstrom and Sephora, high-end boutiques my mother would not even know how to find. My heart hammered against my ribs with pure indignation. Victoria had not just been stealing my mother's money, she had hijacked her entire lifelong reputation of financial honor to fund her own vanity. My mother, a military widow who took immense pride in never being a burden and never owing a single soul a penny, was now marked with a massive financial stain. The sheer audacity of it made me feel like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. How could a woman smile and serve my mother dinner while she was dragging her name through the mud under the soles of her designer heels? This was not a mistake, or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a systematic erasure of an identity. I stared at those red debt totals and realized Victoria was intentionally turning my mother into a debtor to ensure she remained manageable and afraid. I stood there in the damp alleyway, the morning fog from Lake Morrison clinging to the dry raspberry bushes like a cold shroud. The stillness of the neighborhood was haunting, providing a sharp contrast to the roar of the storm inside my mind. I looked through the kitchen window and saw the silhouette of my mother fumbling with a tea kettle, completely unaware that these slips of paper could destroy the very foundation of her safety. These envelopes were the hard proof I had been searching for. Victoria had constructed a digital version of my mother, a puppet she could manipulate to cover the tracks of her own reckless spending. I carefully photographed every single page, securing them in a locked folder on my phone. My mission file was finally fortified with the truth. I felt a crushing sense of disgust for my brother. How could Kian be so absorbed in his own importance that he allowed this to happen in his own house? Or was he simply too cowardly to look at what his wife was doing? Betrayal by one's own blood is a poison that does not just hurt, it rots you from the inside out. I thought about all the times my mother had bragged about her sweet daughter-in-law who sent her little trinkets, not realizing they were just crumbs from the feast Victoria was having at her expense. I squeezed the stack of envelopes, feeling the literal weight of the betrayal. This was no longer a private investigation. I was going to bring these numbers into the light of the Thanksgiving candles, and I was going to make sure these predators answered for every cent they had stripped away from a woman who deserved so much more than their lies. As we walked back through the front door after our morning at the diner, the atmosphere in the house shifted instantly, turning thick and heavy, as if a storm had suddenly pressed its weight against the windows. Victoria was no longer the smiling hostess with the expensive wine. She was standing in the center of the living room, her face twisted into the practiced expression of a grieving victim, prepared to launch a psychological assault that made my blood run cold. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at my mother, her eyes brimming with a terrifying kind of staged pity. "Maisie, we need to talk," Victoria began, her voice trembling with just enough drama to sound convincing to someone who hadn't spent their life reading people under pressure. She stepped toward my mother, reaching out to brush a stray hair from her forehead, but my mother flinched away, moving closer to my side. Victoria let out a long, theatrical sigh and looked at me with an expression of pure, condescending sorrow. She told me that while she knew I wanted to take Mom out for a nice morning, I simply didn't understand the reality of the situation. She claimed that Mom had been forgetting everything lately, that there were days when she couldn't even remember if she had eaten breakfast. Then she turned to Kian as he walked down the stairs, calling out to him to tell me what the doctors had supposedly said about Mom's dementia. She insisted that this was the only reason she had to put everything in her own name, because Mom was no longer clear-headed enough to sign a single document. I stood there for a moment, the silence ringing in my ears as a hot, electric pulse of anger surged through my body. This was gaslighting in its most calculated form. Victoria wasn't just trying to keep the money. She was attempting to erase my mother's very spirit, to delete her presence as a thinking, feeling human being. By labeling her with dementia, she was turning every word my mother spoke into nonsense and every act of theft into an act of protection. I looked at my mother and saw her start to shake, her eyes welling with a sudden, devastating doubt. I could see the question forming in her mind, wondering if she really was losing her grip on the world. That was Victoria's true goal, to make her victim believe they were losing their mind, so they would never dare to speak the truth. It was a staggering level of cruelty, an outsider using a mother's own clarity as a shield for her own crimes. Victoria reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small, unlabeled plastic bottle, setting it firmly on the mahogany coffee table. She told us it was a special memory support medication that a private doctor had prescribed for Mom, claiming she had missed several doses, which was why she was acting so strangely this morning. She poured a glass of water and stepped toward my mother with a look of fake tenderness that made my skin crawl. My mother backed away, her hand catching my arm for support as she stared at the bottle with genuine fear. I looked at the container. There was no pharmacy label, no doctor's name, nothing but a clear bottle filled with white pills. It was a prop, a tool meant to solidify the lie in Kian's mind. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and swept the glass of water off the table, watching it shatter and soak into the rug. I told her that Mom didn't need those pills and that the only person in the room who needed medicine was Victoria, for her chronic habit of lying to everyone she loved. "You've lost your mind, Maisie," Kian shouted, stepping between us with a face red with indignation. He told me that Victoria had been the one here for 2 years while I was off serving, that he had seen Mom forget her keys and forget the gifts he had sent her. He told me I had no right to judge the woman who had sacrificed her time to look after our mother. Looking at my brother, I saw a man who was choosing a convenient lie over a painful truth because it allowed him to ignore his own guilt. If Mom was sick, it was a tragedy he could blame on nature instead of his own neglect. He was a millionaire who couldn't afford to look his mother in the eye and see her pain. Victoria stood behind him, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips, a look that told me she thought she had already won this round. She was certain that her narrative would hold, that the word of a successful tech mogul's wife would always carry more weight than the quiet protest of a woman she had spent months breaking down. But then, my mother spoke. Her voice was thin and it wavered, but it was clearer than I had heard it in years. "I am not forgetting, Kian," she said, her hands clenching at her sides. She told him that she remembered exactly what Victoria had said, that the house by the lake was for Victoria's family to live in, not for her. The room went silent. Victoria's face transformed instantly, the pity replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of desperation. She turned to my mother and told her she was confused again, that she had said the house was a gift from Kian for her. She shook her head at me, whispering that this was exactly what she meant about Mom making things up. She reached out to take my mother's shoulder, trying to lead her toward the stairs to isolate her again, but I stepped forward and stood between them like a wall of steel. I wasn't going to let her hide my mother in the dark for one more minute. My anger had reached its peak, a cold and focused clarity that erased any remaining doubt. She was a genius at twisting reality, but she had forgotten that I had spent the last decade learning how to uncover what people were trying to hide. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my iPhone, swiping through the screen until I reached the folder of photos I had taken in the alleyway. I turned the screen toward Kian, showing him the bright, orange-bordered notices from the bank. I asked him if Mom was so forgetful, who was the person who had used her name to run up $20,000 in credit card debt at Nordstrom and Sephora on Maple Street. I asked him if it was our mother who had gone on a shopping spree, or if it was the woman standing right next to him. I watched the color drain from Victoria's face as the digital evidence stared back at her, the light from the screen reflecting in her terrified eyes. I think about those of you listening tonight, and I wonder if you have ever been in a home where the truth is treated like a threat. I wonder if you have ever been told you were being sensitive, or forgetful, or confused, just so someone else could keep their secrets safe behind your silence. There is a special kind of pain in being made to doubt your own eyes and ears by the people who are supposed to cherish you. If you have lived through that kind of calculated manipulation, I want you to know that I see you. Please share your story with me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so we can continue to bring these stories out of the shadows. My mother stood beside me, her breathing steadying as she realized she wasn't alone in this fight, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of the woman she used to be starting to return. The accusation of dementia was the final thread that snapped my restraint. I was no longer the patient younger sister or the dutiful daughter standing in the shadows of this family's long silence. The air in the kitchen felt charged, heavy with the scent of roasted turkey and the sharp, clinical smell of laser-printed paper. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick stack of documents I had received via encrypted email from an old teammate in military financial intelligence. I slammed the file onto the middle of the Thanksgiving table, right between the golden brown bird and the crystal gravy boat. The sound of the paper hitting the dark wood was as loud and final as a pistol shot in a small room, rattling the fine china and making the wine in the glasses tremble. "Kian, look at this," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "These are not medical records. This is a full audit file from the IRS addressed to Margaret Harrison." I flipped to the first page, my finger stabbing at the bold red ink on the summary line. "Your devoted, loving wife didn't just steal money. She reported $40,000 in phantom income as mom's taxable earnings so she could claim a massive personal deduction for herself. Right now, the federal government is preparing to prosecute our mother for income fraud and tax evasion." Victoria looked at the papers, and I watched the color drain from her face until she looked like gray ash in a cold fireplace. "What is this?" Kian stammered, his hands shaking as he pulled the papers closer to read the official header. I stepped toward him, my presence filling the small space of the dining room. $40,000 in tax savings for Victoria, I said, each word as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. And in exchange, our mother, at 65 years old, is facing a federal prison sentence. While you were busy bragging about that imaginary lake house, your wife was turning mom into a financial criminal just to pay off the debts from her family's failed investments. Victoria let out a sudden high-pitched screech and lunged for the file, her manicured nails clawing at the paper. "You're making this up," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're faking these to destroy me." I didn't flinch. I caught her wrist in midair, squeezing with the practiced strength of a drill instructor until she winced. "Sit down," I told her, my eyes never leaving hers. "You haven't even seen the best part yet." I felt a bitter, hollow satisfaction as I watched Victoria collapse back into her chair. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me then, a wave of nausea that I had to fight back. Here sat a woman who had been eating dry bread and fumbling with expired yogurt to save money for heart medication, yet on paper, she was a high-rolling tax evader with assets she had never touched. The honor of a military family, a legacy built on decades of discipline and service, was being dragged through the mud by a predator who looked at an elderly widow and saw nothing but a loophole. I looked at my mother. She was sitting at the end of the table, her eyes filled with tears and her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. She didn't understand the tax codes or the legal terminology, but she understood one thing perfectly. The daughter-in-law she had tried so hard to love was pushing her toward a dark cell. My heart felt like it was being wrung out like a wet cloth, but I knew I couldn't afford to be soft. Not now. Not when the survival of this house was at stake. Kian tried to speak, his voice weak and pathetic as he sought some way to keep his world from falling apart. "Maisie, there must be a mistake," he whispered, looking at Victoria with a pleading expression. Victoria would never do something like this. She wouldn't. Before he could finish the sentence, I spun around and delivered a slap that echoed through the entire house. The sound was dry and sharp, a crack that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. Kian recoiled, his hand flying to his cheek as his eyes widened in total shock. I didn't stop. I shouted, my voice shaking the porcelain cups in the display cabinets. "You built $1 million empire while your own mother was out scrubbing floors? You are a coward, Kian. You are a millionaire coward who let his wife drain his mother's life and dignity for 2 years, and you still have the nerve to talk about a mistake? Look at these hands." I reached out and grabbed my mother's right hand, pulling it across the table and thrusting it toward Kian's face. "Look at the calluses. Mom has been cleaning offices in town every Friday night just to pay for her blood pressure pills, while your wife was swiping Mom's credit cards to buy designer handbags. Are you even human? Keon stared at the thin, rough, scarred hand of the woman who had raised him. He looked at the deep lines and the worn skin, then he looked down at his own handmade leather shoes. He sank onto the chair at the head of the table, his face contorting with a shame so deep he couldn't even make a sound. Victoria started to move toward him, her mouth opening to offer another lie, but I cut her off. "Don't touch him," I said, "and don't bother talking. You're going to have to explain to the police where the $78,000 from my father's death benefit went. The money he left for Mom's care. The Thanksgiving table looked like a crime scene. The golden turkey and the expensive wine seemed grotesque, sitting next to the gray, cold IRS documents." I felt a strange, detached calm after that slap, a sense that the order of the world had finally been restored by force. My mother's dignity had been reclaimed, not with words, but with the brutal weight of the truth. I looked at Victoria and saw that she was no longer the polished socialite. She was a cornered animal, her eyes darting around the room looking for an exit that didn't exist. Their ingratitude was the deepest wound I had ever seen, deeper than any physical wound I had ever treated in a combat zone. But I was not going to let her escape. I pulled my phone out and dialed the number for the Lake Morrison Police Department, keeping my thumb hovering over the call button. "I am giving you 10 minutes to tell Keon the truth about the lake house," I said, my voice steady and cold. "If you don't, I'm pressing call, and this conversation will happen in an interrogation room." My mother reached out and touched my hand, her eyes pleading with me to stop, to find some way to keep the family together. But I looked at her with a resolve that would not bend. "Mom, silence is just another way of helping the people who hurt you," I told her. "You have been silent long enough." Victoria looked at Keon, then at me, and she knew that the dementia script was dead. She knew that there was no way out this time. The entire house fell into a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing us into the floor, the kind of silence that only comes right before an empire finally crumbles to dust. After the explosion at the table and those cold IRS numbers, the kitchen felt too small, too heavy with the weight of broken trust. I led my mother away from the wreckage of Keon and Victoria's silence, moving into the only space in this house that still held its dignity, my father's old study. The smell of oak and the scent of aged leather from his lazy boy recliner were still there, waiting like a quiet greeting from the past. On the wall, his old tactical map and the photos of him standing tall in his colonel's uniform were still perfectly aligned. I picked up his beret, brushing away a thin layer of dust that had gathered during my 2 years away. My mother sat at his desk, her thin fingers trembling as she touched the bronze star medal resting in its velvet box. This was the one place Victoria never dared to enter or redecorate, the only room where a lie had no place to breathe. In the soft yellow light, I saw my mother beginning to find her footing again, drawing warmth from the husband she had lost, a solid anchor in the middle of the storm that was tearing our family apart. I watched her, and my chest tightened as I realized she had been protecting this room all by herself, keeping it as the last post of her own pride. My father always taught us that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one standing in front of you with a loud voice, but the one standing behind you with sweet words and a smile. Looking at his picture, I felt a deep, biting regret for being gone so long, but at the same time, a new kind of strength began to rise in me. My father's legacy wasn't Keon's millions or a fancy house by the lake. His legacy was loyalty and the simple rule that you never leave a teammate behind. And my mother was the most important teammate I had left. I understood now that I wasn't just fighting for stolen money. I was fighting to protect the very soul of this home. My mother reached into a small desk drawer and pulled out an old letter, my father's handwriting a bit faded but still firm and certain. She read it under her breath, her voice barely a whisper, but steady. "Harrisons do not retreat, Laura. We just regroup." Those words rang through the quiet room like a command from years ago. She looked at me, and for the first time since I stepped off that plane, the fear and the hesitation were gone from her eyes. She stood up straight, smoothing the front of her worn wool sweater, her posture returning to that of a military wife who was ready to face the hardest truth. She didn't need me to hold her up anymore. She told me she was wrong to stay silent just to keep the peace, and that my father would never forgive her if she allowed this deception to continue for another second. We stood there in the stillness of that old room, two Harrison women preparing for the final response. I realized that no matter how much property or money they had taken, they could never take the spirit of this house, where love and the truth stood like a fortress that could not be breached. The power of his memory had given me back my focus. I didn't feel tired or shaken anymore. We were going to walk out of that study not to hide, but to uncover every root of the darkness Kian and Victoria had allowed to grow in this family. The final stage was starting right now. I led my mother back into the living room, where the air was still heavy with the scent of the dinner that no one was ever going to finish. Kian was still sitting there at the head of the table, his head in his hands, staring down at the empty mahogany surface as if it could offer him an escape. Victoria had disappeared into the guest room, probably frantically making calls to her family or a lawyer, trying to find a way to patch together the holes in her stories. But as Kian looked up, and his eyes met mine, I realized that the real danger in this house hadn't been the person who fled. It was the man sitting right in front of me, the one who carried our father's last name and our mother's eyes. He didn't look like a man who had been caught off guard. He looked like a man who had finally stopped pretending to care. I pulled out my phone, the recording app still running, and placed it firmly on the table between us. I asked him why he had signed that power of attorney, how a man who built a tech empire and managed hundreds of people could be so blind to his own mother's suffering. I asked him if he was truly that gullible, or if he had been pretending to sleep while his wife dismantled our mother's life. Kian didn't flinch. He let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and told me that I was the one who was naive. He admitted right then that he had known about the money for months. He had known about the floor scrubbing every Friday night. He had known that Victoria was taking what she wanted, and he had simply let it happen. The weight of his words felt like a physical blow, a sharp blade cutting through the last bit of respect I had for my own brother. He wasn't a victim of Victoria's greed. He was her willing, silent partner in a slow, calculated punishment. I looked at him and saw a man who had allowed his mother to live in poverty, not because he couldn't afford to help, but because he wanted her to feel the weight of it. It wasn't just a financial theft. It was an emotional execution that had been carried out over 2 long years while I was on the other side of the world. I felt a surge of pure disgust rising in my throat. I wondered how many of those expensive dinners he had enjoyed knowing his mother was eating stale bread and rationing her heart medication. Then Kian stood up, knocking his heavy wooden chair back so hard it cracked against the floor. He shouted, asking me where our mother had been on the night our father died. His voice was thick with a resentment that had been festering for over 20 years, a dark, hidden wound that had finally burst open. He reminded me of that night in 1998 when he was only 16, when he had to call 911 alone while our father collapsed on the kitchen floor. He screamed that our mother hadn't been there because she was busy working a double shift at the cleaning company to pay for his college tuition. He told her that he didn't want the money or the degree. He wanted his mother to be home. He wanted her to be there to save our father. And because she wasn't, he had decided she had to pay for her absence every day since. The room went cold as the truth settled over us. Kian had been carrying this bitterness like a stone in his heart, blaming the very sacrifice that gave him his future for the tragedy that took our past. He had twisted her love and her hard work into a crime of abandonment. I looked at my mother and saw her face go as white as a sheet, her hands gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles were bone white. She stood there, a woman who had worked until her fingers bled to give her son a life he wouldn't have to scrub for, only to realize that he had used that very life to judge her. The cruelty of it was staggering. He wanted her to live in lack and dependence as a penance for a night that was never her fault. My mother suddenly collapsed, her knees giving out as she sank to the floor, her sobs breaking out in a way that sounded like her very soul was being torn apart. She begged for his forgiveness, telling him she only wanted him to have a good school, that she never knew our father would leave us that night. She tried to reach for him, but Kian stepped back, looking at her with a coldness that made my skin crawl. He looked at her calloused hands and told her that since she loved to sacrifice so much for him, he was simply letting her enjoy the experience to its fullest. He said Victoria was just helping her fulfill her wish to give everything she had left to her children. I realized in that moment that I was looking at a man who had murdered the mother in his heart a long time ago. He was a millionaire who was morally bankrupt, hiding behind an old childhood trauma to justify the systematic abuse of the woman who gave him everything. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a profound sense of finality. I walked over and helped my mother up, pulling her away from him with a strength that brooked no argument. I told Kian that he wasn't worthy of a single one of her tears, and that his wealth would never be enough to buy back the honor he had traded away for his spite. I reached for his luxury SUV keys sitting on the entry table, the keys to the car he used to show the world how successful he was. He asked me what I was doing, but I didn't even turn around. I told him I was taking our mother to Lake Morrison, to the house he claimed was hers, but had allowed a family of strangers to occupy. I told him that tonight, he would be the one answering the door when the police arrived, and that he could explain his theories on punishment to them. I closed the door behind us, leaving the ghost of his resentment in the darkness of that house. I think about those of you listening tonight, and I wonder if there is someone in your life who uses your past mistakes to keep you in a cage. I wonder if you have sacrificed your youth and your strength for children who now use that very sacrifice to judge you. There is no pain quite like being punished for your own love. If you have been made to feel like a criminal for doing your best to survive, please know that you are not alone. Share your story with me in the comments, and stay with me as we continue this journey toward the justice my mother deserves. The drive through the midnight dark toward Lake Morrison did not make me hesitate. The engine of the luxury SUV roared under my hand, a steady, powerful rhythm that matched the determination growing in my chest. I had to get my mother there, to let her see with her own eyes the gift that her son had used to weave such a devastating web of lies around our entire family. The road was a blur of shadows and tall pines, but my focus was locked on the coordinates of the truth. My mother sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her silence no longer one of defeat, but of a woman gathering her strength for a final confrontation. We pulled onto the smooth asphalt of the paved driveway that led to the magnificent lakefront villa. The exterior was lit with warm, expensive decorative lights that cast long reflections over the gray, choppy surface of Lake Morrison. I could hear muffled music and the sound of laughter echoing from inside the house. I looked at my mother and saw her eyes go wide with a mixture of shock and recognition. We did not bother to knock. I led her through the front door and walked straight into the sprawling living room. Right there, in the center of the vaulted space, Victoria's parents were gathered around a massive dining table, enjoying a lavish dinner with bottles of expensive champagne. They were even using our family's heirloom china, the delicate porcelain set my father had given my mother for their silver anniversary, which I had thought was lost years ago. This was not a vacant house. It was a blatant occupation of my mother's future by the Stevens family, built entirely on her sweat and her silence. The villa was magnificent, with its high ceilings and massive glass walls that looked out over the dark water of the lake. But the luxury of the space felt grotesque when I thought about my mother sitting in her old kitchen, fumbling with those broken blood pressure pills to save a few dollars. I saw Victoria's mother's fur coat draped carelessly over the very armchair that was meant for my mother to enjoy her retirement in. This violation of our family's boundaries destroyed every notion of the life my father had wanted for his wife. These people had not just taken money. They had moved into the space that was meant for her peace, treating her hard-earned legacy as their personal playground. Every corner of this house was stained by Victoria's deception and Kian's cold, calculated neglect. My mother stood there, looking at the strangers eating off her plates, and I could feel the heat of her indignation finally starting to burn away the last of her hesitation. Victoria's father stood up, his face flushed red from the wine as he stared at us in confusion. He demanded to know who we were and why we had entered without an invitation. I stepped forward, standing with the posture of a commanding officer reclaiming occupied territory. I told him clearly that I was Maisy Harrison, the legal owner of this home along with my mother, and that they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their belongings and leave before the county police arrived. Victoria's mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her hand still gripping her champagne glass as she told me not to be ridiculous. She claimed that Victoria had given them full authority to stay there and look after the place, because my mother was confused and unable to manage her own affairs. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped to the marble table and slammed down the IRS audit files and the revoked power of attorney documents. I told them the truth was out, and that they were currently living inside a federal fraud investigation. My mother stepped forward then, her trembling gone. She reached into the small pocket of her sweater and pulled out the little notebook she always carried, the one where she had spent years scribbling down the words of Maya Angelou to keep herself going through the darkest days of her isolation. She looked directly at Victoria's mother and read the words with a steady, unbreakable authority. "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated." She looked around the room, taking in the vaulted ceilings and the stolen china, and she realized that even though she had been betrayed by her own blood, her spirit was still more powerful than any of the people standing in her house. She told them she didn't need their pity or their excuses. She just wanted what was hers. "Leave my house right now," she said, her voice low but carrying a weight of command that made the room go instantly silent. I looked at her and felt a surge of pure, unfiltered pride. This was the woman the world had been waiting to see, a 65-year-old widow who had finally decided to stand up and claim the ownership of her own life. The predators had stolen her money and they had tried to steal her mind, but they could never take away the identity of a Harrison military wife. I could feel my father's presence in that room, supporting us as we pushed back against the intruders. The absurdity of watching thieves enjoy a warm fireplace while their victim lived in lack was finally coming to an end. From this moment on, the lake house would no longer be a lie used to cover up a crime. It was going to be my mother's fortress, a place where the truth was the only thing allowed to reside. The Stevens family began to pack their things in a frantic, humiliating rush. The distant sound of police sirens began to echo over the water, their blue and red lights reflecting off the still surface of Lake Morrison as they turned into the driveway. I walked over and opened the massive front door, letting the cold, clean lake wind sweep through the house to wash away the scent of the expensive perfume and the fake luxury of the people who had tried to erase us. My mother walked over to the main sofa and sat down, her eyes fixed on the horizon over the water. She was no longer a ghost or a burden to be managed. She was the mistress of this house. I stood beside her, ready to greet the authorities. This was not just a legal reclamation of property, it was the total recovery of her dignity. The blue and red lights of the county police cruisers pulsated against the massive glass walls of the lake house, turning the interior into a dizzying blur of emergency colors that seemed to wash away the fake elegance of the Stevens dinner party. Officer Miller and his team moved into the living room with a quiet, practiced authority that immediately sucked the air out of the room, leaving the intruders with nowhere to hide. Victoria was led toward the center of the foyer in a state of total, shivering panic. Her manicured hands, which had spent the morning being pampered at a high-end spa, were now being pulled behind her back and locked into the cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs. I watched her face crumble as Miller read the warrant aloud, the words elder abuse and identity theft echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a final judgment on her greed. There was no socialite poise left in her, no designer mask to hide the raw fear that had finally caught up with her. As she was escorted out toward the waiting cars, looking small and disheveled in the harsh glare of the flashlights, I felt a deep, resonant wave of satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with the restoration of order. The Stevens family followed in a daze, their champagne lifestyle evaporating under the cold reality of police statements and legal consequences. Every lie Victoria had carefully constructed over the last 2 years was finally shattering under the weight of the truth. I stood there by the window, watching the tail lights fade into the mist of Lake Morrison, and I felt a sense of relief so profound it made my heart feel light for the first time in years. Seeing the person who had spent months systematically dismantling my mother's life being held accountable was more than just a legal victory. Justice, I realized, is not just about the numbers on a court document or the amount of money recovered from a bank account. It is the simple, sacred feeling of being seen and being protected by the world you once served with such quiet dignity. The news that Victoria was looking at a concrete sentence of 18 months in prison felt like a precise and necessary calculation. It was a month of her freedom for every month she had left my mother to rot in isolation. It was an answer for every meal of stale bread crusts and every jagged, half-cut pill my mother had swallowed while Victoria bought handbags on her credit. The unfairness that had defined this house was being corrected in real time, and as I watched the cuffs tighten on her wrists, I thought about the calluses on my mother's hands and how they finally mattered more than Victoria's lies. The people who had tried to feed on my mother's future were finally paying for their feast. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the stillness of the room, and a moment later, Kian stepped into the foyer. His face was ashen, the successful tech mogul facade completely gone, replaced by a hollow, gray mask of exhaustion and defeat. He looked at the empty spaces where the Stevens family had been sitting just an hour ago. Then he looked at Mom, who was still sitting quietly on the sofa with a composure that he seemed unable to comprehend. He began to stammer about lawyers, about how he could fix this, how he could use his connections and his money to make the whole thing go away, so the family name wouldn't be embarrassed in the morning papers. But my mother just looked at him, and the expression in her eyes was not anger or even disappointment anymore. It was a vast, cold distance that seemed to stretch for miles, a total disconnection from the son he had become. She told him that he had already handled enough, and that he could use his money to save his wife if he wanted to. But he was never allowed to use it to touch her life again. I saw him flinch as if she had struck him. Then she turned to me and squeezed my hand, telling me she wanted him out of her house immediately. I stepped toward my brother, my voice as hard and unyielding as a stone wall, and told him he had heard her. I told him to get out and stay out, before I added his own name to the list of those responsible for the fraud. Kian stood frozen for a long second, his mouth opening as if he wanted to find one last excuse. But then he saw the total lack of pity in my mother's gaze, and realized the bridge was truly gone. He turned and walked out into the dark night, his footsteps heavy and lonely on the gravel drive. I followed him to the door and slammed it shut, The sound of the heavy oak lock clicking into place felt like the final period at the end of a very long and painful chapter of our lives. He was gone, and with him went the last of the resentment and the lies that had been poisoning this family. I turned back to the room and watched my mother as she began to walk slowly through the house, touching the walls, the marble counters, and the delicate pieces of heirloom china that had been returned to their rightful place. She was not just looking at things, she was reclaiming them with every touch. She was washing the house clean of the scent of the people who had tried to steal it from her. This was no longer a gift from a son who wanted to buy her silence with a hidden house. This was the property of Margaret Harrison, won back through the sheer, stubborn power of the truth. The fall of the Stevens family was the only possible conclusion for a greed that had forgotten the value of a human life. They had lived in luxury while the woman who owned the roof over their heads suffered in silence, and now they were facing the humiliation and the legal ruin they had earned with every fraudulent signature. I felt a surge of quiet pride in the discipline that had brought me to this moment. In the military, we are taught never to leave a teammate behind, and tonight, I had finally brought my most important teammate home from the darkness of betrayal. Seeing them lose everything, their reputation, their stolen wealth, and their freedom, was the only medicine strong enough to heal the long-term wounds they had inflicted on our family. I knew that everyone listening would feel that same weight lifting from their chests. There is a deep, primal comfort in seeing a predator finally caught in the very trap they set for someone else. The balance of the world was restored, and for the woman who had been made to feel invisible for so long, the future was finally bright again. The house suddenly felt incredibly still, but it was a warm, peaceful kind of quiet that allowed us to finally breathe. The moonlight reflected off the surface of Lake Morrison, making the water look like a sheet of silver glass, and for the first time, there were no loud parties or fake laughter to disturb the natural peace of the lake. I went into the kitchen and made a pot of hot tea, bringing 2 mugs out to the porch where my mother was sitting. We sat there in the cool night air, the smell of the lake, and the scent of true freedom mixing together in a way that felt like a blessing. This was the Thanksgiving she had actually deserved, a moment of genuine dignity that didn't require a mask or a secret. There were no more red envelopes to hide, no more bills to fear, and no more calloused hands to tuck away under an apron in shame. There was only the sound of the water and the feeling of being safe in her own skin, surrounded by the walls she had earned. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small bronze plate I had ordered weeks ago, back when I first started to suspect that something was deeply wrong in this house. I walked down the steps to the mailbox at the end of the drive, the moonlight guiding my way across the lawn. I held the plate against the wooden post and began to hammer it in, the sound of the strikes rhythmic and certain in the midnight air, echoing across the quiet water. When I was finished, I ran my fingers over the raised letters. Margaret Harrison, owner. I walked back to the porch and saw my mother watching me, a smile on her face that was more radiant than any I had seen since my father passed away. The struggle for the house was over, and the struggle for her soul was won. We were no longer victims of a son's resentment or a daughter-in-law's greed. We were the victors, and we had finally, truly come home. A year has passed, and the sunrise over Lake Morrison is still as beautiful as a Norman Rockwell painting. I sit on the porch, sipping a hot cup of coffee, watching my mother meticulously tend to the bright red roses along the driveway. I officially filed my resignation from the Army months ago. My uniforms are packed away, but the spirit of protection has never left me. My mother now has her medication, her financial security, and most importantly, she has her own voice back. This house is no longer a ghost. It is a real home for the 2 of us. I kept this story hidden for a long time, but I wanted to tell it so you would know that silence never brings peace. It only feeds what is wrong. Our dignity does not lie in how much money we have, but in whether we dare to stand up for the people we love. Do not let your parents become invisible in the homes they built. Listen to the sighs after dinner and look at the calluses on their hands. The greatest justice is found in our presence beside them. My mother looks back at me and smiles. This peace is something we carry forever.